Valentine is a 2001 horror film directed by Jamie Blanks, but to all intents and purposes, it's best to think of it as being part of the tail end of the mid-90s Scream-inspired revival of the slasher film, just before everything went all remakes and torture porn. Now, in a lot of ways, Valentine is very typical of its era, but at the same time, it avoids a lot of the pitfalls that earlier post-Scream slashers suffer from. What it does have, though, is an incredibly complex and multi-layered plot, which I suppose I'll try to sum up as best I can. Basically, we open up with what looks like your typical slasher movie flashback scene. A young nerdy kid called Jeremy is at a school dance. He asks out a few girls and they laugh at him because he's fucking pathetic, until finally he decides to settle for the class fat girl. Because he might be a pathetic nerd, but even he's got standards. He's not going to ask the fat girl out until literally everybody else has said no. So she says yes, because she too obviously has got low self-esteem, and they get dancing, but then a bunch of kids turn up to laugh at the two weirdos, and then the fat girl says that Jeremy is trying it on with her, and says that he's forced himself onto her. The other kids then kick the shit out of Jeremy in that nice American way, and he's then presumably left scarred for life after that. Flash forward to modern day, the girls from the flashback are all grown up now. They're all out looking for love because it's coming up to Valentine's Day, but they're also getting hunted one by a vengeful figure wearing what's maybe the coolest slasher movie getup of that particular era, a Cupid mask and a long black coat. The guy in question is Valentine, and he sends each of the girls a cryptically threatening Valentine's card before he then kills them. The suggestion, of course, is that it's young, abused Jeremy out for revenge on the girls that were mean to him in the past, because like Jeremy, our Cupid killer's nose bleeds at key moments. But there's always the hint that there's something more going on, that the killer could actually be any one of the sizable cast of characters that are assembled, and that his motives could be far more complex, especially considering how many different plot threads and potential motivations there are for each of the characters. Can the girls figure out who the killer is before he's taken his revenge? So, what's so special about Valentine then? Well, for one thing, it does have this unusually involved, multi-stranded story. The reason for that, I think, is tied into understanding just what kind of a film Valentine is, and what makes it stand out from the 90s slasher crowd. Now, Valentine started off life in the form of a thriller novel written by Tom Savage, which was optioned by Warner Brothers and then stripped down and reshaped into a screenplay for a slasher film, which bears only a superficial resemblance to the original source material. The reason the film wasn't a direct translation of the book itself was because Valentine the movie was very carefully designed in order to be able to sell it to a particular audience, based on the central premise that it's a film that takes place around St. Valentine's Day. And because of the Valentine's Day theme, Valentine is a film that plays out as pretty much half slasher film and half a romantic drama. It's also one of the rare slashers of that period that's almost entirely centred on its female cast, our leads being this group of 5 20-something young women, who aren't just the usual bunch of objectified archetypes or victims to be picked off one by one, but are actually fleshed out characters with believable backstories and interconnected personal histories who have also got a nice chemistry with one another. In contrast with that, the few male characters that we get are nothing more than just a string of passingly sinister-seeming, inscrutably attractive, brooding enigmas, who are never really fleshed out in quite the same way that the ladies are, just because that's the viewpoint that Valentine takes, that the male characters are, by their very nature, sort of difficult to fully get a handle on. And the reason for that is because Valentine is absolutely first and foremost a slasher film that's been designed basically to be marketable to a female audience, or at the very least, one that appeared to offer a far more balanced viewpoint on your typical slasher story than the usual boysy sex and gore angle that's considered the standard way of doing those kind of films. After all, to sell Valentine to that rapidly dwindling 90s slasher audience who are already kind of getting burned out on teen horror films meant that the studio needed to create, essentially, the ultimate horror date movie that would appeal to males and females in equal measure. And whilst young men were considered the traditional audience for films like this, the female audience was thought to need more convincing, hence why, when you compare it to a lot of its contemporaries, Valentine appears to lean much more into what seems to be a much more female-centric spin on the 90s slasher film. That's why there's a greater emphasis on romantic drama and character scenes than there are, for example, scenes of our killer in action. Not that Valentine's stints on the kills though, it's actually got some very cool horror moments in it, but its USP is that it's a romance slasher hybrid that expects us to invest in our characters' love lives and relationships and romantic desires far more than is typical for your average slasher film. Which is fine, it's certainly preferable to the usual kind of puerile, leery, meat-headed frat boy gags and yo dude, hey bro caricatures and self-aware postmodern gags that typify the most loathsome elements of those 90s slashers, where you're just waiting for all the cast to be horribly butchered. At least the characters in Valentine seem vaguely grown up and emotionally mature for a change. I think the main problem is that our leads are an incredibly entitled and self-absorbed bunch that you can happily spend time with on a superficial bright character drama way, but who you can't really ever like or sympathise with. I mean, we start off right from the opening flashback with those characters all painted in a totally unsympathetic light, so to some extent you can be forgiven for sort of rooting for the villain to win in this case. I mean, to put it rather uncharitably, large chunks of Valentine do play out like a soap opera as we flip from one plot strand to another. We follow relationships and see our girls going dating, we see characters dealing with personal problems, falling out and arguing, and often just hanging out and having a good time. Now, to say that those are elements that cannot work in a horror film is of course ridiculous. The problem is that there are large stretches of Valentine that don't feel remotely like a horror film, where there's no suggestion of anything more sinister going on, and where we're just meant to buy into our characters' interpersonal dramas and relationships. We definitely learn a lot more about our characters' personal lives than we ever realistically need to. Now the strange thing is that, in spite of that, Valentine pulls that balance off by using one of the simplest tricks imaginable. It's got a cast of very likeable and or impossibly attractive actors in whose company we're quite happy to be in. Most of the familiar faces in Valentine are people that you'll know from 90s or 2000s TV. In fact, the odd one out is Denise Richards, former Bond girl and the eye-catching star of a few decent-sized big-budget films, who then go into this weird career nosedive of doing very odd low-budget bits and pieces that I imagine, to put it as charitably as possible, aren't really being seen by the same number of people as, for example, Starship Troopers. But as well as having a very hot young cast whose company you're quite happy to while away an hour and a half in, Valentine is stylishly directed when it does break out the stalk and slash scenes. The real benefit of a bigger budget and a more polished production is that you can get away with staging some nicely designed suspense scenes, and Valentine pairs a cool looking killer with some enjoyably dramatic set pieces. It doesn't especially do anything that new or shocking or inventive, as is the way with most studio slashers, but at least it does them in a stylish and committed way. I think the slasher elements in Valentine, as well handled as they are, aren't really what makes this one stand out though. It's seeing those scenes plugged into a context where you're actually involved in something more than just waiting to see people getting sharp objects jammed through bits of their bodies. It's about having a film that sort of looks and feels like a mainstream romantic drama with a cute cast, which just happens to actually be a horror film, albeit not too much of a horror film. It's really what you'd think of as your classic crossover film. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's a horror film that's dressed up nicely to appeal to non-horror fans, but it's also engaging enough and doesn't stint on the horror enough that I think it's a fun watch even for the die-hard horror fan. In fact, compared to a lot of its brethren, it's one of the better films of that particular era. It's got none of the foul-mouthed cynicism and self-referentiality that typifies the post-Scream horror film. It doesn't have a cast of annoying teens that you want to see killed, so you don't have to spend any more time with them. Really, the biggest problem with the cast in Valentine is that they all seem to occupy that incredibly entitled world of never having to worry about anything other than their own psychological hang-ups. It isn't trying to be jokey, it takes itself nicely seriously, and it isn't trying to appeal to a youth market by throwing in weird non-actor cameos. When Valentine needs to, it feels like a proper horror film. It feels like it's also consciously shrugging off a lot of the conventions of those 90s slashers, and is happy just going its own way. It's also got an ending that seems at first almost deliberately anticlimactic. But the interesting thing is that you soon realise that that sense of anticlimax is only because you go into a film like this expecting the last act to look a certain way, to involve that standard final showdown. And when Valentine does end, it does so in a way that makes sense and is actually fairly smart in that it shows an unusual degree of restraint. And I think it's actually that ending that nails down Valentine as a film that has got a lot of slasher film tropes in it, but one that ultimately is about telling a story that doesn't just rattle along down the same rails as so many other slashers. And in a way, that's what sets it apart from a lot of its more self-aware contemporaries, who would lampshade the fact that they had characters involved in a formulaic slasher, but which were ultimately just formulaic slashers. So overall, I think Valentine is fun. There's not a great deal more to it than that, to be honest, but because it feels like it knows what it's doing rather than just cashing in by trying to look as much like Scream as possible, I think it's probably aged better than a lot of its contemporaries. It's entertaining, if never really exceptional, but it does have a nice cast of implausibly gorgeous young people having a good time and very occasionally getting stylishly and dramatically butchered. It's a high-end slasher film that's polished and professional, and what it lacks for in sleazy sensationalism and that punky, boisterous bad taste zeal that typify the best slashers, it makes up for with solid writing and glossy production values. As for a rating, well, I think Valentine deserves a rating of 6.5 out of 10. It does what it sets out to do fairly well within the context of a mainstream 15-rated studio slasher film. It is unusually dense and character-based even for a bigger budgeted slasher, and it almost veers towards its giallo territory at some points, but it's nice to see a film that doesn't play lowest common denominator. One that has some fun along the way with a pretty tropey premise without ever feeling the need to lampshade that tropiness or to poke fun at itself. What it is it's a slasher that takes familiar elements and reassembles them in quite a fresh and interesting way. It's a romantic slasher with a cool killer, a charismatic cast, and a nice line in character drama. And why does it need to be any more than that?